Hi guys, today we're going to be looking at how to choose evidence from real life articles to support the problems that are in Hoot that are also in the real world. Okay, so in this essay, we are not only looking at the problems in Hoot, but we're connecting them to real world problems. So we want to make sure that we have evidence from the real world to back up the problems that happen in Hoot. So we're going to look at 5 different types of evidence you can find from real world articles and discuss those. So you're going to get a link that'll take you to different articles about different real world problems in Hoot and ones today. When you're going through those articles, I want you to look for these different types of evidence. Okay, so the first type of evidence you could use to support the problem in Hoot and to show that it happens in the real world could be a fact or a statistic. For instance, if someone is trying to talk about college graduates earning more money in the real world, they could use a fact or statistic like this. A 2014 study by the Economic Policy Institute estimated that people with 4-year college degrees earn 98% more per hour than those who do not finish. Okay, that's a fact or statistic. They are using a real world example to support their argument. We could also use a story or an anecdote. Say you find an article that tells you a story about a person who experienced this real world problem. Well, we could make it into a story when we're using that in our essays to support the problem in Hoot and a real world story. For instance, if someone wants to talk about someone taking a gap year before they go to college, they could talk about a story they learned about from a real world person. For instance, Colleen Conroy took a gap year and discovered her true passion was for writing, not geology. So she switched her major and had a successful academic career. Okay, so again, if we want to put our evidence into a story based on a real story from a real world article, we could do that. As well, you can just use an example. Okay, so say you're looking through the articles and you find an example of environmentalism, bullying, you find an example of corruption, then you could say something like this. To become a web designer, real estate agent, or chef, you don't have to have a college degree, but having a degree won't prevent you from getting any of those jobs. On the other hand, you can't become a teacher, an accountant, or a doctor or an engineer without a college degree. Okay, this is to prove the importance of college degrees, but you understand. You could use an example of corruption in the real world. For instance, FIFA being corrupt or rich people being corrupt. Okay, you can also use a quote. You're always welcome to quote experts in the field or experts who have witnessed this happen in real life. Okay, so again, this argument is to prove why college is a great way for students to explore their interest. So they used a quote. They quoted someone from an article that said, "Now as a junior, I'm happier than ever. I've stimulated by academic work and enthusiastic about my growth as a writer." Okay, so you're welcome to quote an expert. You can always use an what if situation, but we're not going to look at that in detail for this specific essay, okay? So when you are looking at the real world articles, look for facts or statistics, look for examples, or look for quotes from experts, or look at stories about people who went through these real world things. Next, when you're choosing the evidence, you need to look for evidence that meets 3 criteria. You need to make sure the evidence is relevant, sufficient, and it is credible. Okay, so for instance, if we want to make sure a piece of evidence from a real world article is actually relevant to the topic, then if we are looking for real world examples of corruption, we should not be looking at examples about self-empowerment, right? It needs to be relevant to corruption. So for instance, relevant means it actually supports the argument you're trying to make. Evidence that is not relevant may still be on the same topic, but it doesn't prove the point you're making. Suppose you're trying to convince your parents to let you stay out an hour later. You argue that you are responsible and they can trust you to make good decisions. Something that would not be relevant is if you told your parents, I walk the dog anytime you ask, so obviously I can be trusted. Although you're doing a household chore and it shows you're responsible, it's not the argument you need to make good choices about safety. Something that you could say to your parents is, look, you've left me at home on my own a few times, and every time you did, everything was fine. This proves that I'm trustworthy. This is a better piece of evidence that shows you can be trusted in situations where you're unsupervised. Thus, being able to stay out later seems like a logical next step. Okay, next you want to make sure that your evidence is sufficient. Sufficient means there's enough evidence to support your argument. Sometimes one piece of evidence is enough, but sometimes you need two pieces of evidence to support your argument. So you might provide a fact or a story that proves your point, but if it's only a small sample, it won't be very convincing. Let's say you're trying to convince your principal to make the school start time later. You argue that students will perform better and academically if they wake up later. Something that would not be sufficient if you told your principal this. I personally focus better in my later classes. This is fine that it works for you, but it's not the case for every student in the world. So it's not enough to prove that you should be able to go to school at a later time. Something that would be more sufficient would be a fact or a statistic. A Northwestern University study of over 2,000 students showed that student test scores rose by 10% in schools that moved to a later start time. Because the study observed over 2,000 students, it is a stronger proof that a later start time impacts student achievement. Finally, you need to make sure that your evidence is credible. This means the evidence comes from a reliable, unbiased source. Suppose you're trying to convince your parents to only buy locally grown food. You argue that local food is healthier. Something that would not be credible is if you found a fact from the local association of farmers. The local association of farmers reports that locally grown vegetables have a higher vitamin content than those shipped from stores. It might be true, but because it comes from the people that are saying this and that are going to benefit from it, it's not going to be a credible source, okay? If you say, buy my lemonade because my lemonade is the best, well, you're biased. You want people to buy your lemonade so you can make money. But say, for instance, with the same example, the USDA reported that locally grown vegetables have higher vitamin content than those shipped from stores. It's the same exact fact as above, but it comes from a federal agency rather than the biased local farmers, so it's more believable and reliable. It's credible. Okay, so what you're going to do is you are going to go through the different articles I have provided for the different topics you are discussing in your essay, okay? You might need to find other articles to help support your essay and look for real-world problems, but for the most part, you should be able to find what you need from the essay, the articles I provide. You're going to then find the pieces of evidence you're going to use from the real world and copy and paste those into the real world examples section of your essay planner. Thanks, guys.